in pictures by Moira Yip, and I was supposed to tell you that we are going to record this so that we can put it on our website. And Moira is a professor emeritus of linguistics. She's a GLLT volunteer board member, as well as one of our docents who gives talks and leads walks. She is a photographer and a naturalist extraordinaire at both of those, and author of a blog called Eyes on the Wild. And she and her husband have owned a house in, there's the blog site, they've owned a house in Lovell for the last 41 years and have raised 2 kids coming to Lovell year round. So Moira's going to show us all kinds of beautiful wildflowers, which is a great in between our snowstorms. I love snow, but this is going to be a joy to see all the color and learn from her. And I also just wanted, before I hand it over to Moira, give a shout out to Pippi Ellison, who is hosting this Zoom program for us. So as I said, we are recording. We do ask that you mute yourself. I will mute myself, and we'll let Moira take it away.
Thank you very much for coming, everybody. This is essentially a repeat of a talk I gave in person this summer in Lovell, and there were a number of people who couldn't be there. And so we came up with the idea that in the middle of winter, it might be nice to look at some wildflowers and do it again. Here we go. And questions, would you please keep your questions till the end? If a question occurs to you in the middle, if you type it into the chat, then it'll be there at the end and I'll read it. Or we can turn everybody's mute off and you can put your hands up as well. As Lee said, I do have a blog, and it's not particularly about wildflowers, it's about nature in general, and it comes from wherever I am. So that's often Lovell, but it could be Kenya, it could be England, it could be no matter where I find myself. Today, it's wildflowers. I've organized this 1 month at a time, and the limiting factor is that all these flowers are in the GLLT service area. I've seen and photographed them myself. All these photographs are mine, with one exception, which I'll flag when I get to it. Many of them are on the GLLT properties, and many of them are on my own land. A lot of them flower over a long period, and so I've assigned them sort of arbitrarily to the month in which I took the photograph. My big disclaimer is I am not a botanist, so I may have made errors, in which case do please tell me and the audience. And then we can leave this talk having got our facts straight. It's focused on wildflowers, so there are going to be a few shrubs that I couldn't resist, basically no trees, no garden plants, and they're going to be natives, although I did include a few very common non-natives, but I've flagged them with a symbol, which arbitrarily I've chosen the Union Jack, because you might detect an accent, and you'd be right. Special thanks to Joan London, who helped me with some problematic IDs, but the errors are mine. Joan is much more knowledgeable than me, and she's the head of the team that creates the self-guided walking trails that we have every year. This past year, it was on the Keys River Reserve. This is not a technical scientific talk. I just thought I'd put this up to sort of remind you that flowers have certain pretty standard parts, but as we'll see in this talk, evolution does quite extraordinary things. So the classic flower has, let's say, 5 or 6 petals. Many of these flowers have done extraordinary things. They've merged the petals into a funnel. They've got things that are actually sepals but look like petals. All kinds of things have gone on, but they've essentially got all the same parts. And the flower is there to advertise the fact that there's pollen and nectar and good stuff, so that insects can come and pollinate and carry the pollen to another flower. Every slide has a colored background. If it's green, then it's a plant that's largely found in the woods, which means either it's shade tolerant or it flowers early in the spring before the trees have leaves. If it's blue, it likes somewhere wet. And if it's yellow, it likes somewhere open and sunny. Some plants are very tolerant, they'll grow almost anywhere, and some are fussy. So we're going to get going. January to March, there are not very many flowers. This is what it looked like from my house last January, and not a flower in sight. In February, you start to get a little bits of green appear through the snow, but they're not flowers. These are mosses and ferns that survive under the snow. When the snow starts to melt, they peek out. But when you get to March, the thaw begins. So this is the stream below the Beaver Dam. And it's in full flow because the snow is melting. Now that's a sort of signal that spring is here. On some of these slides, I've put this symbol, and what it's supposed to say is, please don't pick or disturb these flowers. But actually, if you can resist, it's really best not to pick or disturb any wildflowers. Of course, if you see a huge field completely covered in hundreds of thousands of a single type of flower, you're probably not going to do any harm by picking a few and taking them home for your kitchen table. But in general, try to leave them alone and just enjoy them in situ. So March, the thaw has begun. And one of the first things we see is something called the trailing arbutus. It's low to the ground, and underneath the leaves, you start to see the buds peeking out. This is March, but it's not flowering yet. And from when I took this picture to when it flowered was nearly 3 weeks. We'll see the flowers in a minute. So it's not until April that you really get the first pioneers. This is the same stream. The water is now down to a more modest level. Everything's calmed down a little bit. And you're starting to get what are in fact flowers. So I said there'd be no trees. This is the speckled alder, which is basically a tree. But I wanted to show you that even this early, we have a few flowers. The little red catkins at the very top, the little tiny ones, those are the female flowers. And the big, tall, long catkins are bundles of male flowers. And so the insects can carry the pollen from the male to the female flowers, and eventually those female flowers will form little cones which will be the seeds for the next generation. So it's beginning in early April. And now here is that trailing arbutus. We saw the buds, and now these are the flowers. They emerge, there's still snow on the ground very often, and they're under the leaves. You have to hide the leaves. Sorry, you have to lift the leaves to see them. And they're exquisitely beautiful. Lovely little things. And they're maybe 1/4 inch across. By the way, for some reason, I'm having difficulty seeing my notes, and my notes have the exact measurements of the flowers in them. So now I'm doing that from memory. So they're very small, maybe 1/2 inch, but certainly no more than that. When you get to a sunnier spot, you get this azure bluet, really quite a pale but bright blue with a deep yellow center to them, and they are exquisite. I'm guessing, by the way, that many of you are in Lovell in the summer months. And so for the April and May flowers, and even the June ones, you may not get to see them very often. So I'm hoping that you'll enjoy seeing what you miss, in fact. And then we will get to July and August, and then they'll start to look more familiar. We have a number of species of violet in Maine. I think there are about 18 different species. This is the round-leaved violet. It's one of the earliest ones. Very tiny one, this 1/4 inch across, these little yellow flowers. And then in May, suddenly things really start to happen. These 2 bears were in my field at the beginning of COVID. The mother came to the bird feeder right outside my kitchen window. And the following morning, she came back with last year's cubs, but then they heard or smelt us, and so they disappeared across the field. But I thought you'd like to see their backsides going there. I think there might be someone who isn't muted. There's a slightly odd sound. So if anybody isn't muted, perhaps you could just check. That would be great. Oops, we've seen that. So now we're into May, and a lot of the flowers in May are in the woods. The trees, the leaves still haven't come out. There's sun getting through to the floor of the forest. And so it's a chance for these wildflowers to grow. And these are called gold thread. The roots are bright gold little threads that go through the forest, and they're exquisite flowers. Oh, why does it keep going backwards? Okay, why is it doing that? There we go. This is a wood anemone. This one, if memory serves me right, was on our Charles Pond Reserve. And it's a sort of pale, lavendery, pinky, especially on the underside of the petals. Beautiful little thing. And then one of my favorites, wild oats. These plants are a little taller than some of the others. They may be a foot high. And the flowers are single and they hang down in these graceful bell shapes. They're quite lovely. And the seed pod on the top left is a sort of triangular shaped seed pod. And I've still not quite worked out why it's called wild oats. So the bottom left-hand corner, that's an actual oat for you. And I think perhaps the flower bud looks a little bit like an oat. I've never quite worked it out. This is a star flower, and you can see why it's called a star flower, pretty clear. The bud is a delicate pink color, but the flower is white. And then dwarf ginseng. So this is unrelated to the ginseng tree, but it was used for herbal medicines, both by the Native Americans and also, I think, by the early settlers. But the ginseng that you buy these days, if you go to a store to buy a herbal medicine, is not this plant, it's something else. So the whole flower head is perhaps 1 inch across, and each individual little flower is perhaps 1/8 of an inch. Oh, I'm just going back to that for one moment. One of the things I hope you'll take away from this talk is how tiny, but how very beautiful a lot of these flowers are. We don't notice them because they're so small, but if you pay attention, then you can really enjoy their beauty. And small children are very good companions for this because they notice these small things and they find them and they bring them to you in a sort of show and tell way. So this is much more dramatic. This is at least 1 inch, maybe 2 inches across, the painted trillium. Its scientific name is Trillium undulatum because the edges of the petals have this lovely undulating shape to them. And we have 2 trilliums around us. This is the painted trillium, and this is the red or purple trillium. It's bigger, pretty dramatic. I once found a patch of these in my backyard. There must have been about 20 of them. They just sort of appeared overnight. And so the next morning I took a friend to see them and I was very excited. I said, come and see these, they're wonderful. And when we got there, every single one had been neatly bitten off by a deer. Wasn't one left, all gone. I was extremely upset. And in the later in the summer, they have a bright red single berry that you can see at the bottom here. This is one of my favorites. This is the blue bead lily, also known as Clintonia. If you look at the bottom left, it has big leaves, a bit like a tulip leaf almost. And the flower spike comes up from that, and then all the flowers themselves nod down in this graceful way. They're quite a bright yellow, and all the stamens stick out from underneath. And then when the flower is over, you get these bright blue berries. So this is why it's called the blue bead lily. And they're one of these things you have to tell small children, no, they're not blueberries. Do not eat everything you see in the woods. This is a slight fudge because this is a sort of woody shrub. I've only found it once in my own woods, and it's called the American fly honeysuckle, but I think it's so pretty that I've included it. At least the one in my woods is a low sort of bushy thing. It doesn't grow very tall. And it's deep in the woods under the trees, really in the dark. Now, this will be familiar to a lot of you, partly because if you've ever gone shopping for woodland plants, native plants for your garden, this is a very popular ground cover for good reason. The actual flowers are the tiny little things in the middle, and the big white things that look like petals are actually what are called bracts. So the real flower bit's just in the middle. And when the flowering is over, so sorry, top right is, those are the actual flowers in the middle there that you can see. And on the left is when the flowering is over. And then down at the bottom, you get these stunning bunches of berries, hence the name bunchberry, when the flowers are over. So it makes a terrific ground cover, but please don't dig it up in the woods. Go and buy it from a nursery somewhere. But I highly recommend it. It's a very pretty plant. This I've only seen in one place. It cropped up in my own backyard underneath some lilac bushes. It's called the bloodroot. The root apparently is red, but I don't want to dig this up, so I've never seen the roots, so I'm not sure if they're red, but that's what the books tell me. This flower has no nectar, only pollen, and it's very early in the year, so there aren't a lot of pollinators around. It will only flower when the temperature reaches 47 degrees, but many of the bees won't fly at 47 degrees. So when the flower first opens, there's only flies around to pollinate it. And then as it warms up, the bees appear. And then at night, the flower closes up again to protect its pollen. If you see the center picture at the bottom, and the leaf sort of curls around it. And then in the morning, it reopens again. I just think it's so beautiful. This is another cheat because this is a woody shrub. It's related to rhododendron. And in fact, its Latin name, its scientific name is Rhododendron canadense, Canadian rhododendron. The flowers are very dramatic, almost sort of tropical looking, and they come out before the leaves. And so they're quite easy to see. And you see it near water a lot, but you also see it in quite dry places, mountain summits sometimes. Going back, just behind it and below it, you can see some yellow sort of shaggy things. And I didn't even notice these at the time. I only noticed them in the photograph. So I took another look at the photograph, and this is what the yellow shaggy things are. It's something called Pennsylvania sedge. These are the male flowers, and the female flowers are smaller and whiter. And this grows actually in the water, on the edge of the water. Quite pretty. Blueberry, I think you all know what blueberries look like, so I won't spend time on them. They're usually white, but sometimes they're pink. And then another violet, the common blue violet. This is about twice as big as that little tiny yellow violet we saw earlier. And if you were a bee, don't you think you'd find it enticing to fly into the throat of this violet? It's quite lovely. I keep thinking I ought to make candied violets by dipping these into sugar, but I've never tried it. And this is the northern white violet, perhaps the prettiest of all of these three. I've only shown you three. I know there are 18, but I don't have pictures of them all. Wild strawberry. So we're used to the strawberry fruit, but we perhaps don't pay enough attention to the flowers. And then this looks a bit like blueberries, but it's not. This is called a leather leaf. And each of those little tiny bells is about 1/4 of an inch in size. And it grows usually next to water. And so this was hanging out over my beaver pond, just looking like a set of little bells or ballerinas or something it reminded me of. Now, this one, if you come up to Maine early enough in the year and you climb Sabatus Mountain, this is all along the sides of the trail up Sabatus. And you get big swathes of it, like the bottom picture shows. And each individual flower has this extraordinary shape with 2 wings on the side and then a long throat with a sort of tuft on the end. And you can see why it's known as bird on the wing or gay wings. But its proper name is fringed polygula. It's not big. I mean, the whole flower is perhaps 1/2 an inch across. And in fact, for scale, the picture on the right might not be obvious. There is the head of a eastern swallowtail butterfly drinking nectar out of one of these fringe polygula flowers. So that gives you a sense of the size. And it was working its way from one of these to another, ignoring all other flowers. It obviously had a particular favorite for these. This is the Canada Mayflower. And it's also called the false lily of the valley. And although the flowers don't look terribly like it, but if you look at the left-hand picture, you can see that the leaves have that same sort of habit that a lily of the valley does, where there's a couple of big leaves that sort of cup a spike of flowers. And so I think that's why it's called false lily of the valley. And this is another one of many flowers you'll notice whose scientific name is something or other canadense, because many of our flowers, wildflowers here, are also found in Canada, and were probably the Western botanists who first sort of categorized them, I suppose must have found them in Canada first, and that's why they gave them that name. I didn't take this photograph, so I want to thank Pam Marshall for finding her photograph for me. I've only seen this once in the wild, right on top of Sabatus. And I did take a picture at the time, but it was 20 years ago, and for the life of me, I can't find the photograph. So I thought we couldn't have a collection of wildflowers in Lovell without including this. And so thank you very much, Pam, for the picture. It's really quite flashy for a Lovell flower. I mean, most of the ones we've seen are white, but this is altogether gaudier than that. And if anyone sees one of these again, please phone me and I will run over with my camera. I want to see it again and photograph it. This is a much bigger plant. This is about 3 feet high. It's called King Solomon's Seal, and it has these big arching stalks with dangling flowers underneath. And the bumblebees, which are just starting to come out, just love them. So on the right-hand side, you can see there's a bumblebee hanging underneath one of these flowers. And they're quite hard to pollinate because they're quite tightly closed, each flower, and they're long and thin. But the bumblebee is big and strong and tough, and so it forces its way in. And then it does something called buzz pollination, which is exactly what it says. It buzzes, which vibrates the flower, and so the pollen falls off onto the bumblebee. Quite clever, huh? So June, and now summer is really beginning. So the woodland flowers are continuing, but they will now begin to be rarer because the trees are leafing out, and so the shade is increasing. But the flowers of the open fields are now getting going, and the waters are getting warmer, so the aquatic flowers are coming on, and there are more bugs. June is famous for its bugs around us. And so plants that eat insects, insectivorous plants, are sort of getting ready to hunt for their food, so to speak. So if you remember, the last plant I showed you was called a Solomon seal. This is false Solomon seal. So the leaves are very similar, but the proper Solomon seal has its little flowers hanging underneath it. But this just has a bunch of flowers on the very end of the stalk, as you can see in the top photograph. And eventually those turn into berries, as you can see in the bottom photograph on the left. This one, however, is like the original Solomon seal in that the flowers hang underneath, little bell-shaped flowers. They're pink. So it's called a rose twisted stalk. Twisted stalk, why? Well, if you look at the left-hand picture, I don't know if you can see, but the stalk has a sort of zigzag to it. And so that's what gives the plant its name. And when those flowers are over, they will eventually be replaced by bright red berries that hang underneath, looking for all the world like little drops of blood. They're absolutely brilliant red. But all of this is hidden under the leaves. So in order to see it, you have to be able to recognize the leaf and pick it up and look underneath, because they are entirely invisible from on top. This one was photographed on our Heel Pond property. And I'm sure they're on some of our other properties too, but that's where I took these particular pictures. Now, this is something that many of you probably do know. Certainly, if you've been here in June, you'll have admired these. These are called lady slipper orchids, and they are quite lovely. The plant is about 1 foot tall, sometimes bigger, sometimes 18 inches. And each flower is a sort of pouchy shape, like a little handbag almost. And it has 2 sort of winged petals coming off the top, one on each side. And it's usually this lovely pink color, but actually there's also a white variant. So in the bottom photograph, you can see a white one behind it. And in the next slide, if you look first at the white one, that is the pink lady slippers orchid, only it's a white pink lady slippers orchid. And there's a stand of these on a small property near Stoneham Post Office that are lovely, but they're not terribly rare. But never be tempted to dig one of these up and plant it in your garden. They only survive because they have a relationship with a fungus in the soil. And if you move them, they won't survive, and all you'll do is kill them. So if you want to grow them, go and buy one from a recognized nursery. But they're really very beautiful plants. And the flowers last a long time. So once it comes out, you can enjoy it for days before it's over. On the right is something much rarer. This is a yellow lady slipper orchid. Each flower looks like a little shoe, a sort of booty. And then they have two long, curly petals that come down on each side. I didn't photograph this in the wild, so I have to confess that there was a wonderful wildflower nursery in South Paris, sadly no longer there. And he had some of these growing on his land, and I photographed them there. But sorry, I should say they do grow on one of our land trust properties, but I'm not going to tell you which one because I'm afraid we don't want hordes of people trampling them around. But keep your eyes open and you might find them, and they are beautiful. This is also an orchid, but it's tiny. Each little flower is about 1/4 of an inch across, and the whole sort of plant, the whole spike is less than 1 foot tall, and it's very discreet. So you could walk right past it and not notice it, but when you get close, it's really quite pretty. This is one of the first plants that I learned about when I moved to Maine. If you look at the bottom picture first, this is called the Indian cucumber root. And it's called that because if you were to dig this up, which you shouldn't do, the root, which isn't very big, is white and crunchy inside and tastes rather like cucumber and is entirely edible. But don't try this at home because you might get the wrong plant. And a sort of old-time Maine guy who was a professional forester showed me this when I first arrived in Maine, and he dug one up and gave it to me to eat. It was really quite nice, but very small, so you'd have to eat an awful lot of them to make a meal out of. Anyway, the plant has a rosette of leaves, in this case 6 leaves at the bottom, then a long tall stalk, and then another rosette of just 3 leaves at the top. And out of that rosette come these rather unusual shaped flowers, which you can see on the top right. So the petals sort of curl backwards, so they're green, and then the working parts of the flower hang down underneath. And when the flowers are over, you get a black berry, you can see on the left, and the inside part of the leaves turns a deep, dark, purpley red color. This is called bush honeysuckle. It's not actually a lonicera, it's a diervilla, but it is honeysuckle-like. The flowers are yellow, and after they've been pollinated, they turn red, like the one in the background up there. And the whole thing is a little bushy plant that's maybe 18 inches high, something like that. This is lesser stitchwort. You get a big sort of network of tiny, tiny stalks with long, thin leaves and these delicate little flowers. And it's like a sort of piece of lace thrown over the ground because you get a whole collection of these gorgeous flowers. This is also on the heel palm property. This is called foam flower. It's another one that's often sold by wildflower nurseries to plant in your garden. It likes wet areas and it likes shade. So if you're a gardener, you will always be hunting for things that will happily grow in the shade, and this is one of them. It has very attractive spikes of white flowers that are sort of foamy in shape, hence the name foam flower. And each of those flower spikes is perhaps 18 inches high, something like that. And then the leaves are, sorry, it's a mistake. The leaves are a really nice shape and rather a good shade of green. So another enticing ground cover plant. This is called partridge berry. This is an evergreen, little tiny dark green leathery leaves with white veins on them that make rather a nice pattern. And the flowers, if you look at the right-hand slide, are very unusual. First of all, the insides of the petals are covered in, they're sort of shaggy, you can see sort of furry. And there's always 2 flowers, and the 2 flowers grow out of a single root, a single base, and the 2 flowers grow out. And then when the flowers are over, the 2 flowers are replaced by a single berry. So if you look at the top left-hand picture now, there's a big red berry, and it has 2 black dots on it. Each of those black dots is where there was a flower. So it's 1 berry from 2 flowers. It's called partridge berry. I'm not sure if partridges are known to eat it. I don't actually know why it's called that. And it's a very low to the ground, small ground covery plant again. And because it's evergreen, it will, you can, even in the winter, it's doing a job of covering the ground. Totally different, this one, Jack in the Pulpit. So this is related to arum lilies. And the flower is this extraordinary looking thing on the right-hand side. So it has this sort of funnel shape that then comes up and curls over the top in a long pointed sort of awning shape. And in the middle of this funnel is a big, tall, sort of baseball bat shaped spike. And it's actually covered in the most minute little flowers. They're so tiny that I have so far completely failed to photograph the individual flowers. I just can't do it. I think you need equipment that I don't have. But the whole thing is the most dramatic looking plant and quite tall. That's probably a foot tall. And then when the flowering is all over, instead of that spike, you get these berries, and they start bright green, a whole spike of green berries, and then they turn brilliant red. And so you get the spike of red berries. So if you're a July and August person in Lovell, you wouldn't see the flower, but you might see the berries. This is one you probably won't see at all in the summer. So what most of us are used to seeing in June are the top left-hand picture, these huge bright green collections of leaves. I always thought that this was swamp cabbage when I first came here. I mean, what do I know? I'm from England. I thought it was swamp cabbage. And then I eventually discovered I was wrong. It's not swamp cabbage. It's called false hellebore. It grows by streams, likes wet places. And usually you don't see flowers, but sometimes it flowers. And a couple of summers ago, a lot of mine decided to flower. And you get, if you look at the bottom picture, this big tall spike. It can be 6 feet tall. I mean, it's big, but it's all green. So at first it doesn't look very exciting. It's just this sort of green spiky thing. But if you look closely at it, each of the flowers is this lovely little bright green flower. We're not really used to seeing green flowers, but that's what this is, false hellebore. Wood sorrel. This is not rare. We see it all over the place, and it flowers all through the summer. So you might well see this. This is on Sabattus as well. You can see it by the trail. If I always go up the right-hand trail and do a loop, so I see it on the way down. If you go up the left-hand trail, you see it on the way up. It has a yellow flower and extremely pretty leaves that are sort of slightly clover-like, but they're more heart-shaped. And it's small, it's a few inches high and very, very delicate. And this you will definitely see. This flowers all summer in the woods along the trails. It's called heel all, and it was widely used for medicinal purposes, although apparently scientists have completely failed to find any evidence that it works. But, hey, if you think it does you good, you should go on using it. People used to bind it to their foreheads to help with headaches. They put it on wounds. And it grows all around the Northern Hemisphere. So it was here before settlers came from Europe, but it's also grown in Europe. So you can read European medicinal books from the 16th and 17th centuries, and they will talk about this plant. But it wasn't brought here by the settlers. It was already here too. And the flowers are a lovely shape when you get close enough to them. I mean, they're tiny. It's not easy to see this detail in them. The whole flower spike is perhaps 6 inches tall. So each of the flowers is maybe 1/4 of an inch. But they have these sort of open mouths, and the bottom part is all fringy. They're rather nice. Yellow avens, I have nothing particular to say about that. And this is our native blue flag iris. I mean, how beautiful can something be? There's a big clump of them in the bottom left-hand photographs, rather dark. I'm sorry about that. And this grows in the water, grows on the edges of ponds and things, actually in the water. And it's just, a lovely thing. You will sometimes see a yellow flag iris here. That's invasive. It came from Europe. It's not native. And we actually found some at Heel Pond, just 1 or 2 plants, but we're taking that out. But this is a native blue flag iris, and it's not unusual. I have quite a lot on the ponds on my land. Wild rose. Blue-eyed grass. So at the bottom, you can see what the plant looks like. It looks like a clump of grass. And at the end of each stalk, you have these bright, bright, purpley blue flowers with a brilliant yellow throat to them. And there's a bee here that's absolutely covered in pollen. It's got huge bags of pollen from the blue-eyed grass. This grows along, for example, you see it along the edges of roads quite often and along paths. It doesn't seem to mind those kinds of environments. Meadow rue. So this is a big, tall thing. This can grow 3-4 feet high easily. And also you'll see it along verges. It grows along Sabattus Road, mixed in with ferns and things by the side of the road. And there are other versions of this that you can grow as garden plants. There's some that are sort of pinkish color, and they're pretty dramatic because they're so tall. And the foliage doesn't show well in this photograph, but it's quite attractive foliage as well. This is a weird plant. I saw it for the first time. It's called bastard toadflax, and it's a parasite. It's parasitic on other things in the ground. It is apparently native, not introduced. I found it on some ground near the Stoneham Post Office, actually. And the flowers are quite unusual looking, and it's all sort of leathery, the whole plant. And it was about, to give you about 2 feet high, I would say. So it's a biggish plant. We have lots of kinds of loosestrife, Lysimachia, around in Lovell. We're going to see 3 or 4 of them as now that we're getting into the summer. This one's called world loosestrife, and most of these plants are quite tall. They're 2 or 3 feet tall, and they all have yellow flowers, often with a red throat in the middle. A lot of them like wet places, grow near water. Not all of them, but a lot of them do. Oh, and this likes wet places. This is another cheat. This is a woody shrub called sheep laurel. It's sort of distantly related to rhododendron. And you can see in the bottom left-hand photograph that this is growing right next to the water. And it makes a shrub about 3 or 4 feet tall, and these brilliant pink heads of flowers. And I think you can see they're slightly rhododendron-like in their shape. Now, anyone who's been out in a kayak or a canoe or any kind of boat will have seen these, sometimes called the yellow pond lily. And they stick about, 6 inches out of the water, something like that. They have a big fleshy root. That's what the bottom photograph on the right shows. And when the flower is over, they create a rather unusual seed capsule that's quite big. You can see it in the bottom left-hand picture. And it always looks to me like something from sci-fi, a sort of little shop of horrors kind of thing. What I didn't know until a couple of years ago was that the wood ducks like it. These are baby wood ducklings, and they're eating the flowers in the top 2 pictures. And then in the bottom picture, one of them's got one of the seed capsules. It can barely get its beak around it, and it's swimming across the pond, carrying it away, and another one looks like it's trying to steal it. How it's going to get into it, I have no idea, but at any rate, it seems to be a delicacy. I looked this up. I can't find any record of wood ducks eating these at all, but on my pond, lots of them seem to. This is on 5 Keysers ponds, and it's called the rose pogonia, or the snake mouth. I'm not entirely convinced that it looks like a snake, but I kept staring at it, trying to convince myself. I photographed it from my kayak, and I couldn't get close enough to get really great pictures, but it's a very exotic looking thing. And this is our first carnivorous plant. So most plants get their nutrients from the ground and they photosynthesize to get energy and so forth. This has a collection of bladders underneath the water, and the bladders capture tiny organisms in the water and the plant then digests them. So all you see are spikes standing maybe 3 or 4 inches out of the water with the flowers on, but the sort of business part of the plant is under the water. And we have 2 varieties of bladderwort around us. This is the horned bladderwort, which is bright yellow, and later on we'll see a purple one. But it grows in the water, so you need to be out on the water to get close to this, or wading in thigh-high waders or something like that. And this also grows near water. This is the pitcher plant. So actually, let me start with the next slide, and then I'll come back to this slide. So the pitcher plant, its leaves make these pitchers. They're like great big jugs, and they're full of water, except it's not just water. It has digestive juices in it. So what happens is that insects fall in, and they can't get out because the inside of the leaf is covered with downward pointing spikes. So the insect's stuck, and the liquid in it there gradually digests the plant, and that's how the plant gets its food. So this is also carnivorous. And so going backwards now, it has really unusual flowers. So these pictures also taken at 5 Keys Ponds from my kayak. And they have a sort of kind of upside down flowers. They have a sort of umbrella of reddish something. I don't know if they're petals or probably sepals on the top. And then a sort of bulbous part that goes down, and then a sort of upside down umbrella-y bit. I really don't know about the anatomy of this plant. And when the flower is over, that big bulbous part becomes the seed capsule, as you can see in the bottom picture. And they're tallish, these things. They're probably 2 feet high, something like that. But again, in water. So that's the pitcher plant. Now, here we've got, if you look at this slide, look at the Union Jack on the bottom, okay? So I'm not going to talk about these slides. I don't have time. I'm just going to go through them. So, but every slide you're going to see now, these are actually not native plants, but they're plants you might well see, and they're very pretty, but they aren't native. I like this quote: "Weeds are flowers too, once you get to know them." We all hate having this in our garden, but it's very pretty when you look at it closely. Okay, so July. We all know what that is, right? That's milkweed. Whole swathe of milkweed, much beloved, of course, of the monarch butterfly, but many others as well. Close up, it's an extraordinary looking plant. The flowers are very fragrant. If you've never actually smelt one, do have a sniff next time. And they're often covered in bees, butterflies, flies, who are trying to get at the nectar and the pollen. They have a very unusual system for producing their pollen, little packages, which I don't have time to talk about. But you should admire these plants if you're lucky enough to get close to one. This is our native clematis, Clematis virginiana. And here's our white water lily. Again, something will be familiar to you if you go out on the water at all here. We're back in the woods now. This is another one of these little low growing plants. It has a leathery green leaf, and if you tear the leaf, it smells strongly of wintergreen. It's actually the Maine state herb, not the Maine state flower. The Maine state flower is the white pine tassel, which is apparently the only state flower that isn't actually a flower. And this is our state herb, which is a flower. So I don't know who thought this up. But it has lovely, shiny green leaves, also a good ground cover. And in the winter, they often turn a dark burgundy red color, which is very attractive as well. This is an orchid. There's a smaller and a greater version of these, and they differ mainly in their height. And to be honest with you, I don't know which one this is. It was about 2 feet high, and that means it could be a big example of the smaller one or a small example of the bigger one. But either way, Very beautiful plant. And yes, 2 feet high, as I say. And it likes wet places. It was growing next to the stream. Indian pipes. This may look like a mushroom, but it's not. It's actually a plant. It has no chlorophyll, so it can't photosynthesize. So it takes its nutrients and its energy from fungi in the soil. So it's parasitic on other plants in the forest. If you look at the inside of one of these flowers, you can see it is a flower. And after it's been pollinated, it turns its head upward and turns black. So these ones have not been pollinated yet because they're still white and they're still pointing down. Blue toad flax, another one which is called something canadensis, you'll notice. Spreading dogbane. This is a bit woody, probably shouldn't really be here. It has a sap that comes out if you break the leaves, which can be irritating to some people, so you should be slightly careful. And it's maybe 18 inches high, a low bushy thing. This is a harebell, right on the top of Sabatus, this one. And a round-leafed pyrola. A rattlesnake plantain growing deep in the woods. So don't forget, we're in July now, so you stand a good chance of seeing these if you pay attention in the woods. So this, for example, is about 18 inches high, or can be as tall as that. And so you keep your eyes open and you might get lucky enough to see them. This was at Longmeadow Brook, another one of the Land Trust properties. It's called a skull cap because the little seed capsules that you can see on the right-hand side are shaped like little hats. And so this is the marsh skull cap. And this next one is the mad dog skull cap. And I have no idea why it's called the mad dog skull cap. I mean, I'm wondering whether if a dog eats it, something terrible happens to the dog. I don't know. My dog didn't show any interest, so I've got no idea. This is dewdrop, and you can see from the photograph at the bottom on the left where it's next to a mushroom. It gives you an idea of its scale. Small, low to the ground. This is not evergreen, this one, so it wouldn't be as good, for example, as a ground cover because it will disappear in the winter time, but it's very delicate, pretty little flower. This is a tall plant, maybe 3 feet tall. And I have a beaver pond, which the beavers abandoned, and so it dried out. And so there were these sort of large open areas of mud. And one year, a lot of this just appeared, a huge patch of it. And then the next year, it was all gone. So, you know, nature's funny like that. There must have been something about the conditions that particular year that it really, really liked, and then it went away again. The bottom picture here shows 2 different flowers. There's bristly sarsaparilla, that's the white one, and St. John's wort, that's the yellow one. And the close-up on the right is the St. John's wort. And this is in a wildflower meadow created by the Worms, to whom I'm grateful for this, and the next couple of pictures as well. Oh, it's a beautiful, beautiful place. Maybe if you're lucky, they'll take you there one day. This is also there. This is the Canada lily. This is a grand statuesque plant, you know, 4 or 5 feet high sometimes, with these glorious flowers. This, on the other hand, is a tiny, modest little thing. Each of those flowers is 1/4 of an inch long and jolly hard to photograph, I can tell you, and not very impressive. But, you know, you take pleasure in what you can find. And so there's a certain delight in the hunt when you find a flower like this. I mean, anyone can see a Canada lily flower, right? But finding a cowweed, you've got to pay attention. So this is meadowsweet, and the next slide is steeplebush, and they're quite easy to confuse. Meadowsweet is a paler pink and has more sort of side branches to it. They're both varieties of spirea, and you can see that it's covered in little insects. They love it. And then the steeplebush is a darker pink with a single sort of spike. It's another spirea. And both of these are tall. These are, you know, 3 feet, maybe more, sometimes 4 feet tall. dramatic plants. Another loose strife. I mentioned we had lots of loose strife. This is the second one I'm showing you. And this is the third one. This is my favorite. These are called swamp candles. They grow in swamps and they look like flaming torches. They're tall. They're 2-3 feet tall, and with a whole collection of these lovely yellow and red flowers. And they really, they're very striking. You can see them from a real distance. This is burr reed. This grows in the water, and each stalk has big female flowers at the bottom, 3 or 4 of them, and then smaller male flowers up above. So on the right hand picture, you can see the bigger flowers at the bottom and the taller ones at the top. And then this is another one. You've got to be out on the water to see this. These little tiny flowers stick maybe 2 inches out of the water. So the bottom left-hand picture is sort of what you see. You have these shield-shaped leaves, which is why it's called water shield. And here they've been eaten to death by some bugs, so the leaves aren't very pretty. But the flowers poke up. They're a deep reddish color with extra pink bits. And the whole stalk is covered in a jelly. If you look at the top right-hand picture, you see that sort of jelly. And the underside of every leaf is covered in the jelly too. And no one really seems to know what the jelly's for. It's very peculiar when you touch it. It's not exactly slimy, but it's distinctly odd. The leaves are supposed to be edible. Apparently the Chinese sometimes stir fry them, but I've actually never tried it. And I'd need ones that hadn't been eaten by bugs as well. And this is another water plant. This is shrubby, grows in sort of marshy areas. It's quite big. On the left, you can see an eastern kingbird sitting in one of the bushes. That gives you some idea of its size. And these kingbirds were nesting. You can see the nest down there. And each flower is completely spherical. And they're very sort of striking flowers. They have a long, long pistil that sticks out of the middle. And then when the flowering time is over, the whole thing turns a deep pinky, reddy, orange color. And so you get a second show of all these pinky, red, orange things. But it grows in the water, and it's a slightly woody plant. Okay, some more to rush through. We're getting towards the end of the summer here. So these are another bunch of imports: buttercups, Queen Anne's lace. That's a tachinid fly on there. Maiden pink, bird's foot trefoil, broad-leafed helleborine. This is an orchid, and in England, this is much prized. People get very excited if they find it. It's considered rare, but here it's considered invasive. So there you go. A weed is a plant in the wrong place, people sometimes say. So I think this is an example of that. And this was on Chip Stockman Preserve. And so August, I'm going to have to speed up a bit. So those are silver rods in the background. This is a dwarf rattlesnake plantain. And don't forget, this is August, so you might still be here. So you might still see these as well. This is rattlesnake root. So we don't have rattlesnakes in Maine now, but we used to. So there are quite a lot of flowers whose name includes the word rattlesnake. Not entirely sure why these particular flowers got named after rattlesnakes, but they did. So this is 3 feet tall. It's a big plant. Wild bee balm. Many of you probably grow cultivated bee balms. This is the wild one with oh goodness, I've forgotten what that butterfly is on the bottom one on the right. I did know, but I've gone blank. Pearly everlasting. And the flower here is just the yellow portion. All the white things are actually bracts. They're not the flower. The business part is the yellow bit in the middle. This is touch me not. And the bottom picture, you can see the hummingbird likes this, and the hoverfly on the right likes it as well. When this turns to seed, the seed pods are something that children love, because if you touch the seed pod when it's ripe, it explodes. Hence the name touch me not. And the seeds go everywhere. And that's their strategy for dispersing their seeds. Just touching the seed pod will set it off. But look at that flower. I mean, it could be a you know, a rare orchid. It's so exquisite. Purple milkwort, this is a little tiny flower, and the actual flowers are the yellow and red bits in the middle. The yellow ones haven't been pollinated yet, and the red ones have. And all the purple stuff are bracts. They're not the flower at all. Eyebright, another little teeny one. Great blue lobelia. This is a slight cheat. This wasn't really growing wild. The hose pipe in the left-hand picture is a clue. I bought some from a wildflower nursery in South Paris and planted it in my garden, where it promptly seemed to die, wasn't interested. And the following year, it just appeared, not in the flower bed, but in the undergrowth next door and spread everywhere. So it didn't like the flower bed, but it loves the new place next door. And it's 3 feet tall, or well, 2 or 3 feet tall, gorgeous, big purplish blue flower spikes. And the underside of each flower is stripy. This is called tear thumb. And it's called tear thumb because if you look at the bottom picture, can you see those spikes on the stalk? If you touch the stalk, it's really can cut your fingers, quite unpleasant. A tall plant, 3 feet tall or so, but the flowers are very tiny, just these nasty, jagged, painful stalks. Yarrow, with a bumblebee scarab beetle on the right. Hog peanut, this is a little vine that grows deep in the woods, and it trails along the ground and has small flowers on it. Common bone set, the deer like this. It's 2 feet tall or so. Common evening primrose, that'll be a familiar one to everybody, but you might never have been lucky enough to see this moth. This is the primrose moth, and it's bright pink. I've never seen another moth that is pink. And it pollinates the evening primrose at night, because the evening primrose flowers at night. And in the morning, if you're lucky, sometimes the moths are still there inside the flower, sort of hiding. This is a bit of a cheat. This is native to New England, but more to southern Maine than to here. So I grow it, but I bought it in a nursery. The hummingbirds adore it. You can see they're all over it, which is why I grow it. But it doesn't, it seems to be, I think the northernmost part of its reach is really southern Maine. And of course, that could change now that our climate is changing. This is a sundew. It does have flowers, little tiny ones, but it's most famous for its leaves. So if you look at the next slide, the leaves have these spikes around the edge, which produce a sort of sticky liquid. And if a fly lands on the central part of the leaf, all these tendrils close around it and trap it, and then the plant digests it. So this is another carnivorous plant. And we have 2 different varieties of sundew in Maine. They're both shown here. And what you'll notice about this plant will be the leaves. It's very small. The leaves are close to the ground. And the whole plant, the flower spikes can be maybe a foot tall, but no more than that. And the leaves stay down almost at ground level. We're getting close to 8 o'clock. And I know I'm supposed to stop then. We started about 5 minutes late. So I'm going to keep going for about 5 more minutes, but I'm going to speed up a bit. And please, if you need to go, do go. It's my fault, not yours. And I won't be remotely offended. This is Indian tobacco, little tiny flowers, and they're a kind of lobelia. And we have other lobelias here. We just saw the giant blue lobelia, but the most famous one we have is the cardinal flower, which is a lobelia. And actually the shape of the flowers on this cardinal flower and the shape of the flowers on this little tiny blue one are the same. You've got 3 petals at the bottom and 2 at the top, and in between is a long curving tube with a sort of black end to it. So if you look here, 3 petals at the bottom, 2 above with a long curling tube in between. So they may look different, but actually they're closely related. And when you see the cardinal flower, this is where you'll see it, growing in water on streams, deep in the woods very often. We have it at Heald Pond. We also have it on the Wilson Wing Moose Pond Reserve. And it blazes out of the forest statue in August. It's really dramatic. In some states, it's heavily protected and considered endangered. At the moment in Maine, it doesn't seem to be in danger, but please leave it alone. This is turtlehead or chelone. And the flowers have this extraordinary shape, and they do kind of look like turtle heads. You can see why it got called that. So a 3-foot tall plant, grows in water. Again, there's some on Wilson Wing Moose Pond Reserve. There probably is some at Heel Pond. I don't think I've seen it there, but it doesn't mean it isn't there. Arrowhead, which grows in water, and the leaves are arrow shaped, as you can see in the bottom left-hand slide. And this is the other bladderwort. We had a yellow one, and I said that under the water it catches tiny organisms. This is the purple one, more delicate, maybe not as flashy, but every bit as pretty. Water parsnip. Now, when I talked about this in the summer, I identified this wrong. I thought this was water hemlock, and I went into a long riff about how poisonous it was and, you know, how it killed Socrates and things. That's not what it is at all. It's water parsnip. So I had it wrong, and I do apologize to anyone who was there. It was a good story, but it's not true.
It's an amazing fund of knowledge.
Marsh St. John's wort. This is a little tiny plant. This is a foot high, and they're such delicate flowers. We're getting to the end, because we're getting to the end of summer. Pickerel weed, which you may have seen, grows on the edge of ponds. Butterflies love it. And then fall begins, and we get the goldenrods and the asters. And I'm not even going to try to go through all of these. There are something like 18 different goldenrods and 20 different asters, and there's just too many for me to begin to, I can't tell the difference. So I've just one or two I've flagged and identified. That's a pair of ambush bugs mating away. This is a zigzag goldenrod that grows deep in the woods, very different from where we see most of them, which is out in the fields. This is a grass-leaved goldenrod. And this is our only white goldenrod, so it's called a silver rod, not surprisingly. And then the asters, which are daisy-like flowers. Many of them are bluey, purpley colors. A lot of them are white. We've got 2 clouded sulfur butterflies trying to mate on that one. A calico aster, top right. This is British, so we'll keep going. And then September, everything's beginning to wind down. So you can see all the goldenrod in the fields there. But this I had never seen in my life till this summer, and it was growing almost opposite my house on a driveway going off into the woods. And it's called purple gerardia, and it's beautiful. Never seen it before. Took me a long time to identify it. Black-eyed Susan grows all summer long, and it's still flowering in September. Wild mint. This was growing on Keyser Lake out of a crack in the rocks down by the side of the water. And when you go close up to the flowers, which grow right by the stalk, look how lovely they are. An orchid, nodding ladies' tresses, one of the last orchids of the summer here. Joe Pye weed. And this, I photographed the caterpillar from underneath because I liked its little feet grabbing onto the stalk. So, this is another parasitic plant. It has these funny purple flowers, and it's called beech drops, grows in the woods, and it's parasitic on beech trees. And these are called beggar ticks. And this is having one of those moments about the bird. Somebody's going to have to help me here. It's a warbler. Well, anyway, it was feeding on these plants and loving every minute of it. And if you think of a daisy has these big petals, but the working part of the daisy, of the flower, is the center. The petals are actually irrelevant. They're just there to attract things. This flower only has the center. It just doesn't have any petals. So it looks very unimposing, but all the essential working parts of the flower are there.
I think it's a yellow rump, Moira.
Thank you. That's exactly what it is. Thank you very much. Just having one of those moments. I'm not in bird mode. I'm in flower mode. So it just went. It's a yellow rump warbler. Thank you. And then in October now, things are really disappearing. Witch hazel, this is a tree, so it's really a cheat, but look at those extraordinary flowers. When I was young, we used to use an extract of witch hazel as an astringent. was something you could buy in the pharmacy for your bathroom makeup counter. British. And then in November, basically winter is beginning. I did find this November in full flower. And this full flower. And in December, you really think it's all over. But look what I found on the shortest day of the year, December the 21st, a witch hazel flower. So nature never really gives up. And it's a good thing because all sorts of things depend on wildflowers, their nectar and their seeds as a food source. And I won't go through the list. I'm just going to show you for fun. This is the very, very end, I promise you. A chipmunk feeding on love in the mist seeds. And it did this sort of balancing act between the stalks. And then it started a different bunch of chipmunks eating the seeds of the cosmos. And then this one was eating my dianthus plants. And it's here it is. This is the final slide.
What a photographer she is.
And it really goes for it in a moment. It does. So this is the end of the talk, just to show you that wildlife likes flowers too, for somewhat different reasons from us. And it there he goes. Got a whole bunch of them. Look, he took a flower. Do you see? He didn't go for the seeds. He's taken a flower bud, which I could otherwise have enjoyed. And he's there he goes. Okay, so that is the end. Thank you so much for being patient with me. I'm sorry that I went on a little bit long. My apologies for that. And I will stop sharing my screen. And I'm very happy to answer questions, but I'm not a botanist, so I may not be able to answer them. But perhaps someone else will be able to jump in and answer them, in which case, please do. And you can either put on your video or wave your hands around, or you can type something in the chat, whatever you like.
Moira,
Yes.
I have a question. Is there, I mean, you went through the June flowers, and you mentioned a wild rose. Do we truly have a wild rose, or are they all invasive? What
Well,
I didn't write down the
well, it's a good question. I had the same uncertainty, and I looked it up, and as far as I could tell, we actually do have a native wild rose here. But I wasn't sure either, and I may have got that wrong. So you should probably do what I did and keep checking, and I'm not entirely sure. I mean, this is one of the things I struggle with when we worry about invasive plants and things, is that the term invasive plants to me conjures up something like the kudzu vine that is going to take over and really threaten things. We have many, many plants that have been here so long that they will always, I mean, when there's no possibility of eradicating, let's say, clover from the United States, not going to happen, you know. So I think realistically, there's a spectrum of how much we should worry about these plants, or at least a spectrum of how realistic it is to try and get rid of them. And I think wild roses sit in that category somewhere. They've been here a very long time. They are everywhere. So we have to live with them, for better or worse, you know.
I think so.
Moira, if no one else has a question, I'll just butt in here and say, ask another question.
Okay.
I've had painted trillium on my property, and it's a sort of mixed woods. It's white pine and hemlock and beech. And anyway, when I first started going to the property 20 years ago, there was tons of painted trillium. Now, I don't know why I don't have it anymore. If the deer eat it, does that mean that it will not come back because it hasn't had a chance to get what happens to it? It's totally gone.
How sad, because it's so beautiful.
I know.
Well, there's something that I'm embarrassed to say I don't know about trillium without looking it up, which I'm not going to do right now. I don't know whether it's an annual or a perennial plant. So if it's an annual plant, then it's not going to reappear in the same place anyway. It will be spread by seeds, it might be spread by roots, but the same plant won't come back if it's an annual. If it's a perennial, even if its flower is eaten, it will regrow in the same place. Eventually, over time, if the plant is eaten back time and time and time again, it probably just will give up. I mean, it's the same in one's garden with a perennial. If you keep cutting it back year after year after year, eventually it says, I'm not going to bother with this, forget it. And I don't know for trillium which category it falls into. Those red trillium that on my property were eaten by deer didn't come back. I mean, there's the occasional one, but that big patch didn't come back. That was it, 1 year, it was gone. It was really upsetting. Does anybody else have a question? I've flattened you with too much information. Okay, well, thank you very, oh, sorry.
No, it's not a question. I have a suggestion. I'm planning on Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday I'm taking a course from Eagle Hill. It's on carexes, which are sedges.
Yes, I showed you one sedge, in fact.
You did, and I am wondering if you might have reversed the male and female spikes.
Oh, on the carex, that is possible.
I don't know. Just
Okay.
just double check.
Well,
I'm doing preliminary work. I just noticed.
Well, it's entirely possible because I couldn't see my own notes. So when I present live, I on the screen you just see my slides, but on my screen I see my lecture notes. But on Zoom, we couldn't work out how to make that happen. So I've just been looking at the slides along with all of you, and I've been doing everything else from memory. So I could easily have got that the wrong way around. It's entirely possible. And it might be right in my notes, because I would have carefully checked when I made the notes. So yeah.
Sorry, don't mean to be. I wasn't criticizing in any way.
No. I know. The answer is I can't tell you whether I got it right or wrong without going back to my notes.
Well, Moira, thank you so much. I think everyone enjoyed it. The photos are absolutely amazing. And I learned a few things, and I
really, because you know far more about this than I do. So.
No, I don't. And so it was just, it was wonderful. And wonderful to see all of those species, and there were some I had never seen before.
Yeah. Well, I kept finding new things, and so which is such a delight when that happens,
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And like you say, when you look, you see things.
Yes, that's right. And you start focusing, and then there they are. It's like, oh, I've never seen that before. Right. Oh, look, I can see all these faces. There's Barbara Hauser. Hi, Barbara. Hello. Hi, Beth. People are putting their screens on.
All right. So we thank you very much. We thank Pippi very much. Just to let everyone know, we do have a Zoom program on spiders next month. Spiders in Maine, and we have a Maine master naturalist, Donnie Sanderson, who's going to lead that for us. And Moira's going to do an insect talk this summer at the library. So we look forward to that as well. So I think that's it.
Thank you all for coming. Bye now.
Thank you.
Enjoy the snow if you're in Lovell. I'm very jealous because I'm down in Boston now where it just rained. No fun.
We will. Good night.
Bye. Good night. Oh, and Pippi, thank you so much, Pippi. Thank you.
Yeah.